I was able to meet and work with a variety of patients who have some of the genetic diagnoses that we learned about in graduate school. Most significantly, I also had an older sister who was a genetics patient at Boston Children's Hospital in the 90s. And so I just feel really honored that my career path has taken me here to now working at Boston Children's. And it's given a really beautiful symmetry to my life and a nice way to honor my sister who had a genetic diagnosis herself.
Hey there, I'm Luca Fusar-Bassini. I'm a PhD student in computational biology at EPFL in Switzerland, and you're listening to The Biotech Futurist. The Biotech Futurist aims to foster deep understanding and discussion about exciting hot topics in biotech, but I want to say from the beginning that it is by no means rigorous in teaching the subject. And for the sake of outreach, sometimes we need generalizations that, of course, simplify the reality of the science behind what we're discussing. But I can say that my guests and I do our best to be clear and to go in depth. You can imagine to be out with me and my expert guest for a friendly conversation, to get a general understanding and more curiosity, having fun as much as I've had recording this podcast. This podcast has no sponsors, and any reference is not meant to support any commercial activity. This podcast is a solo effort, so if you wish to support me, I'd be grateful if you followed the Biotech Futurist on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Instagram, or your top podcasting platform, and share it with your friends. With that said, I am excited to move on to today's conversation at the Biotech Futurist. Good morning, good afternoon, or good night. Today I am excited to discuss cutting-edge trends in genetic counseling, especially prenatal genetic counseling, with the outstanding Tori Suslovitch, or as a friend Tori. Tori works in the U Lab, where she supports the logistical, educational, and emotional needs of patients and families enrolled in translational genomic studies. Tori is also an accomplished marathon runner and a podcast expert. Tori, I've learned so much from you during my stay in Boston. Thanks so much for being here. Can you briefly tell us your story, values, and what led you to what you do today?
Thanks, Luca. Thank you for having me. As Luca said, my name is Tori. I am a genetic counselor. I graduated from the Boston University Genetic Counseling Program a few years ago in 2019. So that means that I, at the time of this podcast, have been a genetic counselor for about 3.5 years. And so today we'll talk about what genetic counseling is, both as a process and as a profession. And I'm excited to talk to you, Luca, about some really interesting topics within genetic counseling. Before we begin, I just have a few caveats or disclaimers that I would like to cover. First, that all of this is just my individual perspectives and some of my experiences and opinions. But this is really, genetic counseling and genetics in general is a really big field full of ethical and social and medical and regulatory issues. And so this will just be a small peek into a really large and complicated landscape. So by no means is this comprehensive. And I might not be correct about everything, but I will try my best. And lastly, this discussion, just from my experiences, might be a little more USA system focused. The certification system for genetic counselors is the same between the United States and Canada. But for the rest of the world, the systems might be a little bit different. So I will mostly just speak about what my experiences have been and what I know, but just note that the systems might be a little bit different between different places as well.
Sure, so let's talk about genetic counseling. You told me genetic counseling is both a process and a profession. Can you describe what this means?
Yeah, so I think this is really important to understand. Genetic counseling as a process is the process of helping individuals understand and adapt to how genetics impacts their health. And so the two keywords in that are understand. So this would lead to maybe some education, talking about clinical things, helping them understand and gain knowledge about genetics and about how that impacts them directly. And then the second keyword there is adapt. So this really leads into the counseling aspect of it. And so helping families and individuals work through some of the questions, thoughts, challenges of how genetics and genetic disease might impact them psychologically, emotionally, within their family system. And so that adaptation is really the counseling part of that process. This also might play out in like clinical and logistical help that genetic counselors can provide to their healthcare as well. So that's genetic counseling as a process, which we'll talk a little bit about more in the rest of this episode. But then genetic counseling is also a profession. It takes this process and creates a niche within the healthcare system where within a variety of professional settings, genetic counselors can learn about how genetics impacts that field of medicine and then be able to help individuals within those different sectors. So genetic counselors work in a variety of professional settings. The biggest and probably most well-known among these is genetic counselors who work in a clinical setting. So this means usually in a hospital system, in an academic medical center, working in departments such as genetics, oncology, reproductive genetics, cardiology, and neurology, among others. There are a lot of areas that are just starting to introduce genetic counselors as the understanding of genetics within those fields is expanding. Currently, to my knowledge, the most number of genetic counselors work in the oncology or cancer genetics space. So this would look like helping people understand the genetic risk factors for hereditary cancers, like breast cancer, ovarian cancer, colon cancer, and a variety of other ones. And then talking about genetic testing within that setting, what the potential results might be from that genetic test, and then the implications for screening, like earlier and more frequent mammograms or colonoscopies, and then if there's any other surgeries that might be indicated, and how that might impact other members of their family. So oncology and cancer genetics is one that folks tend to maybe be a little more familiar with, and maybe slightly easier to understand. And so that process gets replicated for a variety of other medical specialties like cardiology and neurology as we learn more about genetics in those areas. So in addition to clinical genetics, genetic counselors can also work in other non-clinical settings, including laboratory genetics, research genetics, which is what I do, work at biotech companies, genetic testing companies, maybe even in public health, and a variety of other settings. The breadth of what genetic counselors are working on has really expanded in the past couple of decades. And to me, this is really exciting that the voice of genetic counselors as professionals in both genetics and in helping people psychologically and emotionally can be brought to other fields to help bring our expertise and our perspectives to these areas. It's really exciting to me.
Yeah, this is outstanding. Thank you, Tori, for explaining. So, relating to this, what's your typical day or week, if there's a typical day or week? Or what is a typical day or week of a genetic counselor working like you in research?
Yeah, so my career is slightly different than the picture that I just painted about clinical genetic counseling, but there are a lot of similarities. So the similarities would be that I help work with patients and their families to help them understand and adapt to how genetics might be impacting their life. I use my organizational skills and my communication skills, and I really try to practice empathy in everything that I do within our work. But I currently am a research genetic counselor for the U Laboratory at Boston Children's Hospital, which is where I met you, Luca. And so this lab works really at the intersection of genetics and neurology. So we work with patients and families who have diseases that impact the central nervous system. So that's the brain and the spinal cord, and also sometimes the eye. So we work on a small handful of ophthalmological diseases as well. We also work in the kind of newly minted term of interventional genetics.
We've already discussed this with Winston Yan in a previous episode, indeed.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, Winston probably already did a way better job of explaining this than I would. But essentially using genetic knowledge to guide therapies and to guide treatments, either gene-related therapies or otherwise. So taking genetics more from like a descriptive stance, describing genetic things are, doing diagnostic testing, taking it one step further into therapies, treatments, and other interventions. And this is really exciting with the improvements and advances within genomic medicine in the past few years.
Yeah, I think we'll have space later in the episode to discuss how genetic counseling relates to recent advances in the field of genomics in general and interventional genomics specifically.
So within the U Laboratory, I am a liaison between researchers, patients and families, and other areas like their healthcare providers or patient advocacy organizations. We receive a large number of inquiries to our laboratory asking about our work. So I field these inquiries and we try our best to respond to everyone individually. And try to, if we can't help them directly, then try to connect them with researchers, with resources that might be helpful for them. I also, for the families that are enrolled in our studies, I help facilitate the informed consent process. And then I also help with regulatory submissions, some project management. And then I see my role as just helping families with whatever they need, logistically, educationally, emotionally, helping set and manage expectations as the study moves forward.
Wonderful. So, can you briefly explain to us what is an informed consent in this case? I mean, specifically for research in interventional genomics.
Yeah. So, the informed consent process is a process that works to help patients and their family members understand what the research process will be like for them, and then any details regarding risks, limitations, privacy and confidentiality, the logistics of being in the study, and as I said before, setting and managing those expectations over time. It's also a two-pronged approach where we have a written consent form, which describes everything that I just listed, all out in the form that families can read and can keep like a copy for themselves to reference if they have questions in the future. And then it also is a verbal process where families will meet with me or maybe one of our other people in the lab to discuss the details of the study, have a chance to ask questions. And the key word here is informed. So we want patients and families to feel like they have a really good understanding of what participating in the research study will be like. And then my most important job is to set expectations and discuss the risks and limitations. So even though these risks and these limitations might be challenging to discuss or challenging to hear, they might be troubling or disappointing, I want to make sure that families have a really good informed understanding of what the research process will be like.
Sure, that's very clear. Thank you, Tori. So maybe it's time to discuss what led you to the U Lab, what led you to genetic counseling, and what drives you, your passions, your biological interests.
I always knew I wanted to study biology. That was never even a question for me. And I'm not really sure why. I just have always really loved it. And so in undergrad, I studied biology. And I had minors in chemistry and education. I have always had an interest in science, but also I love working with people, and I knew that I wanted that to be an aspect of my career. So I thought about science education, I thought about public health, I thought about a variety of career paths that combined science and also working with people. And so my senior year of my undergrad, I took an immunology class. And in this class, we, instead of lab, occasionally we would do basically what I now come to understand as like genetic counseling role plays, where we would get a case of a patient with an immunological genetic disease like 22q deletion syndrome or ataxia-telangiectasia, and we would get paired with a partner and review that information and look up what genetic testing might need to be done, what clinical follow-up might need to be done for that patient, how those genetic changes impacted their immune system. And I, through this process, found it really interesting. And I also saw that I figured that, wow, this would be really helpful for the person on the other side of this. In that case, like a parent of a child with an immunological disease. And so I went to talk to my professor and, just said how much I liked it. And she's like, oh, there's a word for this. It's genetic counseling. And that specific professor had thought about genetic counseling as a career path for herself at one point. So she kind of like mixed it into a lot of her lectures and, things that we were doing within this class. So this was a really exciting moment for me, that once I started to research genetic counseling as a career path, it was like, oh, wow, this is it. And that was a really exciting series of moments for me. And it really felt like all my prior interests and my past experiences were coming together. So for example, I had taken American Sign Language classes for like 6 years at Beverly School for the Deaf in Massachusetts. And so I had decently proficient American Sign Language, and there are a lot of genetic diagnoses that result in deafness. So that's something that I have run into as a genetic counselor. I also worked at the Paul Center, which is in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, for also quite a long time, with patients who, or at that point, students who have a variety of physical and intellectual disabilities. And so I was able to meet and work with a variety of patients who have some of the genetic diagnoses that we learned about in graduate school. Most significantly, I also had an older sister who was a genetics patient at Boston Children's Hospital in the 90s. And so I just feel really honored that my career path has taken me here to now working at Boston Children's. And it's given a really beautiful symmetry to my life. And a nice way to honor my sister, who had a genetic diagnosis herself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Tori. So I think now it's time to discuss a couple words that will turn useful to understand better what genetic counseling is and for the rest of this episode. So first, talking about genetic testing, I think it's very fundamental to distinguish between pre-symptomatic and predictive versus diagnostic. Can you describe what is the distinction here?
So when genetic counselors are coordinating genetic testing for a patient, they might order a variety of genetic tests. And as you said, they can fall in these two categories. So pre-symptomatic genetic testing would be done prior to disease onset. So for example, this might be done in an individual who, due to their family history, you might think has a hereditary cancer risk, but that individual has not had cancer themselves. So prior to potential disease onset, that would be pre-symptomatic for that person. Another example of pre-symptomatic genetic testing is genetic testing for something like Huntington disease, in which someone might be at risk based on their family history, but they might not show symptoms yet, but might decide to get testing ahead of time. On the other side, there is diagnostic genetic testing. This is done so that we can gain a genetic understanding of the symptoms that already exist, so that presenting phenotype. And this can be really helpful for management decisions, for like what we do in the ULab, targeted therapies, and then can also psychologically be really helpful, like in potentially relieving guilt, having an understanding of what caused the disease, and for finding and connecting people with similar experiences and similar diagnoses together.
Yeah, that makes absolutely sense. So to quickly sum up, the difference here is that a pre-symptomatic test is a test that people order before there's any symptom, but when there is some risk, for instance, because your parents have something that is caused by some genetics. On the other hand, a diagnostic test tries to explain the possible genetic underlying mechanisms of a given symptom that you present. So these are examples of genetic tests. And maybe, Tori, do you want to spend some more words about genetic testing in general when it is ordered? I mean, you've already given us some beautiful examples, but what's the role of genetic testing today? How extensive is its use in a clinical setting, and especially for newborns? What do you see in the foreseeable future for genetic testing?
So when a genetic counselor meets with a patient, a big question is determining what genetic testing might be appropriate for that patient or that family, if any. So there are some situations where someone might meet with a genetic counselor, and due to one reason or another, no genetic testing might be appropriate in that situation. And the genetic counselor should be able to sit down with that family and explain why that is the situation. Also, genetic testing should always be optional and should always be up to the discretion of the patient. So just like we talked about informed consent in the research setting, there's always informed consent for genetic testing, and it should really be a two-way conversation between the genetic counselor and the patient or their client in order to discuss if genetic testing is right for them at that time. So when a genetic counselor orders a genetic test, and just for the sake of clarity, in this example, I'll use hereditary cancer testing. So say if a genetic counselor orders a hereditary cancer risk test, some things that they might discuss with the patient would be the timelines. So how long it might take to get the results back from that genetic test, and if it impacts any other timelines for their medical care. So if it needs to be expedited for another reason, things like that. The logistics of the genetic test. So they might discuss if it is a blood draw or it could be a saliva sample or something else. And then the genetic counselor will discuss the possible results of the test. These possible results for most genetic tests typically look something like one option being positive, one option being negative, and one option being uncertain. So what this means is that the positive result would be that the genetic test was able to discover or elucidate or identify a genetic explanation for the symptoms at hand. So in this case, this would be that the individual's family history or personal history of cancer probably has some genetic component to it based on the results of that test. A negative genetic test would be that in the testing that was done, it was not able to identify a genetic explanation for the symptoms at hand. So this does not necessarily mean that whatever the patient is experiencing is not genetic or hereditary in any way. It just means that the test couldn't identify it. And all sorts of different types of genetic tests have different limitations. So a genetic counselor should discuss with that individual exactly what that negative result means and if there's any limitations to that type of test. And so that ends up being usually a very specific, nuanced conversation based on the characteristics of that situation. Lastly, a genetic test can have an uncertain result. And so within the genetic counseling and genetics literature, you might read this as a variant of uncertain significance or a variant of unknown significance. And then this gets put into an acronym of VUS. And so this is a result where a genetic difference between what the patient has and a control reference sequence is found. So something is a change within the genetic sequence, but we're not quite sure if that's just natural variation, like the non-problematic natural variations that cause some people to have blue eyes and some people to have brown eyes. or if it is indeed a change that causes something that results in disease. So these uncertain results, a genetic counselor can talk about the implications of them and the limitations of our knowledge of genetics and why that leads to these uncertain results. But then occasionally in the future, the genetic testing lab will be able to do what's called reclassification. So they take a look again at these uncertain results and say, did we learn anything new in the previous years that changes our understanding of this variant? And 9 times out of 10, these uncertain variants get what we call downgraded, and we learn that they are just benign, naturally occurring changes that do not contribute to disease, just part of our natural variation between individuals. But then about 10% of the time, they do get what we call upgraded to a pathogenic or a likely disease-causing genetic change. So our understanding of genetics and genetic variation is always changing, and we're learning more and more. And we try to, as a genetics and genetic counseling community, apply that to our classification of genetic testing and those genetic variants.
Yeah, wonderful explanation, Tori. Thank you. So I think Tori has just touched on a very fundamental point, that is, knowledge is evolving, so also what we can understand about gene variants is evolving, and it depends on what researcher found out. So as a molecular biologist / bioinformatician, on my side, I understand the process of genetic counseling as something that is shifting day by day thanks to what we understand in a research setting. And this relates to gene panels. So what genes we test and what we can infer for a given number of genes depends on what we know currently. And also, the interpretation, as Tori mentioned, is changing. Gene panels are fundamental because they represent the best of our knowledge, so we can trust them generally, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we don't add excessive number of genes to gene panels, because that may result in overdiagnosis in case the knowledge on that given gene that we may want to add on a gene panel is uncertain today. So it's always a thing of costs and gains, and you have to balance between the two. So variant calling is still limited. We can understand something about genes, but we are still in the process of learning. And as such, we need to come up with gene panels and testing technologies that can really make the most of what we know now, but at the same time don't try to guess more than what we know. And I think that there's a nice paragraph on an article that Tori sent me that I will post in the description of this podcast, but I'd be happy to briefly read, because that's also inspiring. So the paragraph says so. What message does it send to people with disabilities, their families, and their advocates if we continually add, seemingly willy-nilly, more and more genetic conditions to a prenatal testing list, especially if they obtain no tangible benefit from testing? More testing readily begets further routinization of testing. And when you start testing lots of pregnancies for lots of conditions, you start creeping further into eugenic territory. So that's also opening more and more questions. What I want to point here is that, gene panels and genetic testing must always be connected to a tangible benefit for patients, and it's always evolving thanks to research. So I hope I didn't steal too much of Tori's time conversation, and I want to go back to what Tori was saying, asking her 2 questions at once that came up listening to what she was saying. So first, if you, Tori, could clarify the difference between a mutation and a variant, or the definition of the two. And on the other side, how do you communicate uncertainty clearly? What are the strategies to communicate uncertainty to patients? As we said, genetic tests are to a certain extent uncertain.
Look, I think you bring up a really good point, that more information isn't always more answers. So with genetic tests, we might want to cast a wide net so that we can get as much information as possible. But we also want to make sure that the information that we're gathering and we're communicating is meaningful to that patient and their family, or whoever the recipient of that genetic information is. So thanks for bringing that up. I thought that is a really important point. So when we talk about the results from these genetic tests, we typically, the meaningful or interesting results are what we call a variant or a mutation. So this just means a deviation, a change from the reference sequence, which is a sequence that we have a decent understanding is a good control and not indicative of pathogenic variants that might cause disease. I typically use the words variant or genetic variant and mutation interchangeably. There's some really interesting discussions within the genetic counseling community about this terminology. So variant describes like that actual genetic change and is descriptive in that it's just a variation. So it seems a little more neutral, right? Whereas mutation might be a little more of a loaded word, where we're thinking about it being mutated. Maybe that is more descriptive of something that is pathogenic or something that one might ascribe a quality of like being abnormal, or it just might have a more negative connotation to it. So there's a really interesting discussion about which one of these words we should use and when. Also, some people think of mutation as like the process of getting a variant. But in my experience, I have a job as a genetic counselor to make sure that I'm communicating clearly and in a way that is relevant to the patient or the client that I'm working with. And I have also found that in the general public, and maybe due to the media or how things are presented in like biology textbooks or whatever, people tend to be a little more familiar with the word mutation. And so for clarity, I either tend to revert to using the word mutation, or at the beginning of the call, in what we call like the contracting expectation setting period, I might say, I might give this distinction between mutations and variants, ask if the patient has heard of either of them, if there's a terminology that they would prefer to use, and then explain that I might almost accidentally use them interchangeably, but just for clarity.
Sure. So my next question, still on terminology, would be the distinction between screening and diagnostic, and the distinction between patient and client, so we can next jump to genetic counseling having all the fundamental words in place.
Yeah. So going along with understanding the pre-symptomatic or predictive genetic tests along with diagnostic tests, we can also take the variety of genetic tests that are available and split them into this other two sets of categories, which are screening versus diagnostic. Screening tests are used to maybe more quickly, more easily, more accessibly split groups of individuals into a higher or lower risk category. This is done in newborn screening, in which this is done on pretty much all newborns across the United States. And they look for diseases that are early onset and have a very clear intervention associated with them, and that are significantly serious enough that it warrants this early newborn screening. But this newborn screening is a screening test. It's not perfect. And it looks just to put the patients into either low risk for any one of these diseases or high risk. So that high risk result might need to be followed up with something called diagnostic testing, where one would get a more definitive yes or no result from that test. So screening tests just have a larger margin of error, but they are really helpful from like a public health standpoint, whereas diagnostic tests have that more definitive yes or no quality to the results that we obtain from them. And then one more piece of vocabulary that I would like to discuss is that the distinction or the use of the recipient of genetic counseling might be called a patient in some scenarios and might be called a client in other scenarios. A lot of the genetic counseling literature that is out there uses the word client, which is consistent with other types of counseling, like mental health counseling, things like that. I work in an academic medical center, so I often say patient, but this is another situation, maybe similar to mutation versus variant, where I might use these interchangeably.
So finally, it's time to delve deeper into genetic counseling, right?
Yep.
Okay, so what are the goals of genetic counseling?
The goals of genetic counseling will be different based on the specific situation, but generally are to help facilitate the patient or the client learning about the genetic qualities of their health or other situation, and then facilitating what we call non-directive or some neutral counseling. So this is a description of kind of the social rule that genetic counselors have with their patients and their clients. And this is important for facilitating informed decision-making that's based on the patient's priorities and their values and what is meaningful to them and their family. And so genetic counselors should be there to help with explaining educationally the details about genetic testing or other aspects that they're discussing that day, help with logistics of anything that family needs, supporting them emotionally through the process, but through that process, striking a balance between giving information, being informed, and being helpful, while also still being neutral and guiding the patient and their family to what really reflects their values and what reflects their priorities.
Yeah, so I guess we should jump to the challenges in the genetic counseling profession. Maybe we can start by describing how typically, let's say, in the situation of a parent having a child that receives a worrisome result from a genetic test, how does a parent meet or contact a genetic counseling, and what happens during the first times they meet?
Yeah. So in a situation where someone is meeting with a genetic counselor for the first time, as in the situation that you gave, Luca, they will probably meet with a genetic counselor, maybe also alongside a physician, like a geneticist, an oncologist, a cardiologist, and we'll meet with both of those healthcare providers. The genetic counselor usually starts with something called contracting, where this is just a check-in to kind of get to know each other, get a mutual understanding of the goals of that appointment, about what the patient and the family want to get out of that appointment, and then laying out like an outline of what will be discussed that day, setting some expectations. Next, in a lot of genetic counseling scenarios, they'll take a family history and a medical history. So this is getting an understanding of the genetic and hereditary background of that family. Sometimes this process can bring up really difficult things. Our relationships with our families are not always easy. And then sometimes we have to ask about, people in one's family who have passed away or who have been sick. So this can sometimes be a sensitive thing to work through, but is important for, getting an understanding of, how genetics interplays with our health. And then the genetic counselor will probably talk about why we're thinking about genetic testing, what the implications of that are, and then go over some of those potential results that we discussed before. And then the genetic counselor should be available to that patient to discuss any concerns, any worries, and anything that they would like to talk about emotionally. And really, I think that a good genetic counselor should be able to lay out, the risks, the limitations, the challenges, but then also foster empowerment within the family to feel like they are in control of their situation as well.
Wonderful. So, continuing the discussion about the challenges within the genetic counseling profession, can you describe for us the historical origins of genetic counseling and also its relationship with eugenics?
Yeah. So there are some significant challenges within genetic counseling as a profession. Historically, genetics in general and genetic counseling as a profession was associated with the eugenics movement, which, Luca, I'm hoping you will discuss in great detail, maybe in a future episode of this podcast. But essentially, genetics for a long time was used within this eugenics movement to wrongly justify that some genetic makeups were better than others, and to promote reproduction for some people and not others, and really resulted in a variety of atrocities within the United States and worldwide. So a lot of what the genetic counseling profession is tasked with now is separating from this, from eugenics, but also very firmly and clearly acknowledging that this is part of the history of genetics and genetic counseling, so that we can address that head on and not pretend like it never happened. I am a firm believer that being very clear, upfront, thoughtful, and including this in genetic counseling education is really important for history not repeating itself. In addition to that, another challenge within the genetic counseling profession is that there is a lack of racial, ethnic, gender, and socioeconomic diversity. Most genetic counselors identify as white women who also come from more privileged, higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So this is something that the genetic counseling profession is really trying to tackle with providing scholarships for underrepresented communities and trying to increase awareness and accessibility of genetic counseling, both as a process and as a profession, to individuals who have been historically underserved.
Yeah, so I've got a curiosity I think I never asked you. So what was the reaction of the genetic counseling community to the He Jiankui case, the Chinese CRISPR babies? I mean, that's something big that recently happened. I think you were still finishing your studies, but maybe you have a glimpse of what genetic counseling told the journals and the science about this.
Yeah, so you're right. When that event occurred, I was in the last semester of my genetic counseling training, I believe. And I remember discussing it during a class that I was taking along with a lot of my other genetic counseling classmates called Business of Biotech. And so in this class, we were talking about different types of genomic medicine modalities, and it was really pertinent to a lot of our discussions. And I think something that the genetic counseling profession faces as a challenge is that there's really complex societal understanding about genetics, and genetics in general can really easily bastardize if not taken seriously, and make sure that vulnerable communities are protected. So this was definitely a concern for the genetic counseling community, because I think it just adds to this irresponsible use of genetics, and something that was quite concerning. In our work now in the U Lab, we're also concerned about this and about use of genomic technologies, because we want to make sure that they're being used in a responsible way, to make sure that patients and families are empowered but also protected if they're in a vulnerable situation. And then we also want to make sure that individuals who are using these technologies are open and willing to sharing some of the challenges, some of the side effects, so that the whole field can grow and learn all together.
I think that relating to eugenics, we should briefly also discuss the challenges in prenatal diagnostic testing and prenatal genetic counseling. Nice paragraph that I read in one of the articles you shared with me, Tori, and I will link in the podcast notes, is that genetic counselors both offer prenatal diagnostic testing that allows individuals the opportunity to avoid the birth of a child with a disability, and they advocate for the rights of individuals who have a disability. And another paragraph says that the guidelines should also strongly recommend research into the specific ways that prenatal knowledge of any condition included in the panel, of gene tests, either do or don't enhance obstetric neonatal management and or prenatal emotional preparation and adaptation to having a child with a condition. Maybe we've already started discussing this from time to time in this episode, but can you comment on these observations and in general on prenatal diagnostic testing and prenatal genetic counseling?
Yeah, I'd like to start by saying that while I am a genetic counselor that is technically certified to provide prenatal and reproductive genetic counseling, I am not practicing in the prenatal and reproductive space. So I am, still retain a lot of interest in this, still talk with my prenatal and reproductive genetics colleagues, but I'm not currently practicing in this space. So there are probably a lot of other prenatal genetic counselors who could speak to this maybe in more depth and more lived experience than I could. But Luca, I think you're right. There are a lot of ethical and social issues that come up with genetic counseling in general. And then due to the sensitivities of reproductive rights and due to the sensitivities of prenatal genetics in general, I think that these ethical and social concerns get heightened within that specific space for a very good reason. So it is a really difficult question and a really difficult balancing act of allowing individuals who are carrying pregnancies to be able to choose what they do with that pregnancy and what they do with their body, and be able to have, as we talked about with informed consent earlier, to have informed decisions about how their pregnancy is going. And so that's on one side. And on the other side, thinking about individuals with disabilities and what the message might send when we are doing prenatal screening and prenatal testing, that one can imagine that this might seem like that is bringing a lower ascribed value to their quality of life or to their value as individuals in general. So the genetic counseling profession and society in general is tasked with this really challenging balancing act of autonomy for individuals carrying pregnancies, and then also autonomy of individuals with disability. And so there are a lot of really valid perspectives on all sides of this argument, and it's important to listen and to think about how this impacts us medically, how it impacts us socially, and how it impacts us psychologically. And so to also provide one example that I think about a lot in this, as I'm a genetic counselor who works with pediatric patients, so children, who have very severe neurological diseases. So really rapid neurological decline, loss of vision, loss of speech, loss of movement, have dozens of seizures per day, and have early, can have really significant medical complications, and sometimes these diseases also result in death during childhood. So these are really severe conditions. And in an interesting and to me upsetting way, a lot of these very severe diseases are not screened for standardly in the prenatal space. And this is because they are very rare. And so the likelihood of a genetic test picking one of these up is quite low. And so in a lot of places in the United States, it's not common to screen for these very, very severe conditions just because they're uncommon. Whereas a lot of pregnancies, especially in individuals carrying a pregnancy who are over 35, most pregnancies are screened for Down syndrome, which is more common, but one might argue less severe than some of the diseases that I just described that we work with.
Now it's time to jump to the barriers for effective genetic counseling. I mean, there are several possible barriers ranging from the financial to the emotional side of things. Can you describe briefly them for us, please?
So some of these barriers, as you listed, the first really being regarding access to genetic counselors. So this might be due to that there might not be a lot of genetic counselors within their area, or that the financial barrier to seeing a genetic counselor is too high. I think that in the past few years, we've made some improvements to access to genetic counseling, because with a lot of places being able to move to virtual or remote telehealth appointments, the ability for people who live in rural areas or who have trouble getting to their local hospital for one reason or another are able to see genetic counselors just over telehealth, which I think has done a really excellent job for access. For example, a lot of the families that we work with, might have children with mobility aids. It might just be a lot of time, money, and to get to the academic medical center. And so it's good that we have this option, especially in a counseling scenario where most of the time we're just talking. There are also emotional barriers to genetic counseling. So I think some individuals might be hesitant to see a genetic counselor due to societal stigmas about mental health, seeking mental health help, just due to that word counseling within the profession name. And also there might just be a lot of fears about, finding out about genetic things, guilt, and how that might radiate through the family. And then lastly, a barrier for effective genetic counseling that I think is very significant is the lack of diversity in genomic datasets. So a couple times in this podcast so far, we've talked about the reference sequence, which is what we use to help us determine what is a genetic variant and if that genetic variant is pathogenic or not. Unfortunately, the genomic data sets that we use for these references and for what we use for a lot of the databases for genetic and variant interpretation are overwhelmingly from individuals of white European background and are not overall very diverse. So this results in that a lot of types of genetic results are more accurate or better understood for individuals of white European backgrounds. And this, of course, is wrong. And so there's been a big push, and there should be continued efforts to try to increase the diversity in these genomic data sets and in the tools that we're using for variant interpretation.
Wonderful. So something that we've started discussing here and there, I suppose, is how the genetic counselors communicate uncertainty effectively. Can you go deeper for us into this, please?
Yeah. So genetic counselors in all contexts are responsible for communicating results that might be really uncertain. So some examples of this are that, say, one might come back with increased risk for hereditary type of cancer, but that result might just tell them that they're at increased risk for cancer by a certain percentage, but it doesn't tell them a yes or no if they will develop it. Maybe in the work that we do at Boston Children's Hospital, we give uncertainty regarding timelines of the research study. In prenatal setting, there might be some screening tests done that might put into a high risk or low risk category of a certain test for pregnancy, but might not give a very definitive answer that might need to be followed up with future testing or might just remain uncertain depending on the situation. Genetic counselors are trained to communicate and work through this uncertainty. And I think that this is done by, number one, trying to educate and set expectations right at the beginning so that these uncertain results hopefully don't come out of nowhere, that there has been some adequate pre-test genetic counseling to discuss the possibility of uncertain results and set expectations for how those are managed. And then I think genetic counselors should also provide a supportive role while families are making difficult decisions or hearing these uncertain results. So being that helpful but also neutral party to support the patient and their family during that time. And then I think when this is done appropriately, that this fosters empowerment and resilience, that even though there is that uncertainty, that we can work medically, psychologically, socially, and within the family to foster empowerment over the situation. And one way that I really try to and like to do this in our work is if there are family members who are together, so say two biological parents or say a parent with like grandparents or aunt or uncle or whoever they have as their support system, as trying to foster really thoughtfully them relying on one another within that support system. Even though that is really difficult, parenting a child with a rare disease is extraordinarily difficult. A lot of times there are other siblings in the situation that need parenting and need family support as well. But I believe that as much as the family can work through those challenges thoughtfully, see each other as helpful partners within working through this like devastating, really difficult situation, then I think that will be psychologically and emotionally really beneficial for the patient, for the parents, and for the other siblings too. That regardless of the uncertainty or regardless of genetics' true ability to help in that situation, I think that emotional family empowerment can be really, really pivotal.
I think we've already touched this a few times in digressions, because in the end this is just the main theme of this podcast episode, genetic testing. So we've already discussed what are the possible results of a genetic testing, how it works, but can you describe for us deeper a few things relating to genetic testing, such as when it might be appropriate? So when do you suggest a genetic test to be performed, or about the timeline and the logistics? I'm looking forward to hearing what you say about this, Tori.
Yeah. So as I've said before and will probably say again, the answer to this question is really dependent on the clinical situation. But overall, the reasons why a genetic test might be indicated would be, number one, that there is a decent clinical hypothesis that the symptoms at hand have some genetic origin to them or some genetic contribution to them. So in pediatric genetics, this often tends to be a really wide net because there's a lot of genetic things that interplay with our health. In the cancer setting, there are some types of cancers that might throw up kind of a red flag that there might be a hereditary syndrome running through the family. So those might be cancer diagnosed at a very young age, multiple family members with the same type of cancer, or cancer that happens in the same organ but bilaterally. So like breast cancer in both, like separate primaries in both breasts, or kidney cancer in both cancers that seem like they popped up each individually on their own. And so some of these situations, in addition to specific cancer diagnoses like ovarian cancer, might throw up a red flag that there might be genetic testing indicated. And those are all laid out really clearly in a set of guidelines through NCCN that folks can reference, and they're updated as we learn more about genetics in general. So that's all to say, number one, that there is some decent hypothesis that the situation could have a genetic contribution that could possibly be elucidated by a genetic test. And then the second reason is that upon discussion with the family, that genetic counseling seems reasonable for them at that point in time. So that this is information that they want, this is information that is meaningful to them potentially, that this is information that they could use, and that the emotional or social or other barriers to genetic testing are either low or manageable or not present. So taken together, some suspicion of genetic disease combined with patient or client's understanding and openness to genetic testing is kind of the situation that I would look for as a genetic counselor.
Yeah, that's inspiring. So how do you typically think that the results of a genetic test impact the people who asked or who received the genetic testing and their family members on the medical, psychological, and social sides?
Yeah, so there are a variety of ways that results of a genetic test can impact an individual. I like to believe that these results are overall positive, and that is why we do the genetic test in the first place, and that this can be meaningful and useful result, but there are a lot of challenges that a genetic test result can cause as well. So some of the positive aspects to receiving a genetic test result might be, in the case of a positive result, one might get an explanation for the symptoms at hand. One might be able to connect with a community that also has been affected by that genetic diagnosis. There might be medical management decisions like treatment options, surgery, screening, medications that might be more effective based on that positive result. So those are a few ways that getting a positive result can be beneficial for a patient or their family. For a negative result, this could be maybe quite relieving. That negative result means that they did not inherit a hereditary disease, or that means they're at lower risk for something that before, based on their family history, they thought they might be higher risk of. But then these results also have challenges associated with them. There's a huge emotional burden with getting a positive genetic testing result. It's really solidifying the diagnosis and the situation, which can be really psychologically difficult to process. And then this can also be associated with feelings of guilt or shame or worry that are associated with that result, which I like to remind people, we don't choose our genes. None of this is really in our control. So genetic counselors, if they're doing their job, should be able, or should feel empowered to try to assuage those feelings of guilt or shame, but often that's easier said than done. In the situation of a negative test result, it can be also difficult, say if someone is experiencing active symptoms, that if the test result is negative, then it might feel really concerning that they still don't have an answer. It might be disappointing to not have an answer. And as we talked about before, that uncertainty can be really difficult psychologically as well.
Sure. So, Tori, anything about genetic testing that I'm forgetting to ask you?
No, that seems like a pretty good explanation or a pretty good discussion. One other thing that I can add, or we can add this at the end, is that if folks are interested in learning more about genetic counseling, both as a process and as a profession, that they can go to the National Society of Genetic Counselors website. And so this website provides up-to-date information about genetic counseling for individuals who might be interested in pursuing genetic counseling as a career. And then for people who think they might want to see a genetic counselor for something that's happening with their health or their family history, then the National Society of Genetic Counselors also has this Find a Genetic Counselor tool. And so this will help point you to a genetic counselor that you could see in your area. So that's a really helpful tool for the public. One last resource that Luca and I have been referencing that is really interesting academic blog about hot topics in genetic counseling is called the DNA Exchange. I highly recommend that if this episode was interesting to you and that you're interested in some ethical and social topics within genetics, that you check out the DNA Exchange. They post articles about, they're like opinion pieces about all sorts of topics within genetics and current events. And so I highly recommend that you take a look there if you are interested.
Nice. So we'll make sure to post the links to these resources that Tori mentioned in the description to this podcast. So now, Tori, it's time to ask you 4 a little bit more specific questions. The first would be, how do parents, in your experience, emotionally go through the process of genetic counseling?
Yeah. So again, this is just my experience. And for context, as I mentioned before, I'm working with mostly parents of children who have quite severe neurological diseases. And the answer to this is that parents go through this process in a variety of different ways. Some families are really data driven and are really interested in learning about the scientific aspects of all of it. and are motivated by, to learn through that mechanism, whereas other families really focus more on kind of the emotional impacts. And we spend a lot of our time talking about those social, psychological, and familial aspects of things. And in my experience, I've found that it's really interesting it is very difficult, if not impossible, to predict how a family will interact and react to the information that I'm giving them within a genetic counseling session. So in my experience, it seems not to correlate with race, with sex, with gender, with what they do as a career, with where they are located geographically, with any factor that I can think of. I have not seen any patterns in kind of reaction style and coping mechanisms versus any of those kind of demographic qualities that I've listed. And I just thought that this is really interesting. One pattern that has been described in the rare disease literature and that I have observed in my genetic counseling career so far is that within the family unit, there usually tends to be somewhat division of labor between when we're thinking about a child with complex medical needs, their healthcare, and participating in research and all interacting with the patient advocacy organizations. There's often one parent who seems to spearhead a lot of that. So seems to be the medical and scientific manager, if you will, whereas the other parent is really picking up the slack for a lot of the other parental duties, like helping take care of the other children, providing financially for the family, doing other logistical things like this. This is obviously a great generalization. We do work with families who are single parents, which I acknowledge is very, very, very difficult, or families who have different structures, different family unit structures as well. But I just find this an interesting observation and potentially helpful for healthcare providers in helping families navigate through the beginnings of a diagnosis, and just acknowledging that families do whatever they need to do in order to best take care of themselves and their children.
Wonderful, that's interesting, thank you. So the second very specific question would be, how do you and other genetic counselors, still to your experience, develop strategies to be supportive in difficult decisions in cases in which there is no clear right or better answers, let's say?
Yeah, I think that the most important role that a genetic counselor could play in a decision process like that is really first validating that decision is difficult. And then also validating that there's no clear or right or better answer, but that the right answer will come from that family recognizing, identifying, and using their priorities and their values in order to make that decision. And really trying to encourage that empowerment, that whatever decision they choose to make for themselves or their family is the right one for them. And to try not to compare with other families or other situations, no matter how difficult that might be.
Yeah, wonderful. So another question I'd be curious to ask you is, how has genetic counseling changed in the recent years with the advent of new technologies, say sequencing-based technologies and many others?
So something that I love about genetic counseling is that genetics is always changing and we're always learning more and more. So it's been really exciting to even think back to when I was starting genetic counseling school, not that long ago, 5 years ago, that so much has changed. And, we're just learning more every day, even though that sounds cliche, it's very true. So some ways that genetic counseling has changed within that time has been a lot driven due to changes in the recommendations that come from professional societies about what types of testing should be done. So earlier I mentioned those NCCN cancer risk testing guidelines. So those have been updated as we've learned more. And that's really changed how cancer genetic counselors approach genetic testing for their patients. Overwhelmingly, that has been more inclusive of genes and of syndromes. And then in addition to that, we've had expansions in the incidental findings that genetic tests might look for, and in what is screened for in the prenatal setting with carrier screening and things like that. And then genetic counselors, as I mentioned before, have been working in a variety of different areas outside of the clinic, including biotech companies, laboratories, and in other more kind of non-traditional roles, which I think is exciting for the genetic counseling profession in general.
So I guess now it's time for my last very typical, very awkward, very without answer, let's say, question. That is, what are the major trends, hopes, and challenges in 5-year span or in 20 to 30 year span from now on? And relating to this, what are your dreams as a genetic counselor, as a professionist in this career?
So for genetic counseling as a profession, in the coming years, I would like to see increased diversity within the profession, so increased diversity for genetic counselors in order for us to better serve and help our patients. And then in addition to that, better diversity for the genomic datasets, as I mentioned earlier, and just building a better and more resilient understanding of genetics that encompasses lots of people and lots of opinions as well. For my goals as a genetic counselor, honestly, I really love the work that I'm doing now. I find that it is an immense privilege to work with the families that we do. They are so creative in the solutions that they find for their children and for their families. And it is really, really an honor to work with them every day. I also am really fortunate to work with the other folks in our lab who are so intelligent and so motivated, and it is just really an honor. In my future career as a genetic counselor, I'd love to also continue to be involved with genetic counseling education. So in the past, I've helped with some teaching at Boston University's genetic counseling program, and I'd love to continue to be even more involved in teaching future genetic counselors about a lot of the stuff that we talked about today, and a lot of the other topics. I think the education piece to me seems so important because it's just a great way to radiate knowledge. And then I also find it really meaningful and really fun to work with students as well. So those are my goals.
Yeah, for sure, education is really what can touch many lives at once, and I can say that you're a good educator. I mean, stating this from our meetings in the U Lab, and also I think that, yeah, what you've just said is inspiring, and I'm really lucky to have met you, and I've discussed so many of these things with you during lunch breaks and whatever in Boston. So thank you again, Tori, for being here with me today and for sharing with us all your insights about genetic counseling, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you more and more ideas in the next few, hopefully, years as they come to life. So thank you again, Tori.
Thank you so much, Luca, and thanks for having me and for wanting to talk about genetic counseling. It's really exciting.
You've just listened to A Biotech Futurist, a podcast by Luca Fusar-Bassini. This is the first series, and a new episode is out every Monday. Please consider subscribing and rating the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, Instagram, or your top podcasting platform. And if you liked this episode, consider sharing it with your friends, as the growth of new podcasts relies on word of mouth. If you have any suggestions, don't hesitate to reach out to me on Instagram or Gmail at thebiotechfuturistpodcast@gmail.com. You can find the full AI-generated transcript of this episode on my website, lucafusar-bassini.com. I'll also post the links to the main papers referenced in this episode, which you can find here in the description too. Thanks for listening to A Biotech Futurist. I am looking forward to talking with you in a week.